Welcome to FemLead, the podcast on female leadership and role models. Prepare to feel inspired and better equipped to navigate your career path. I am Alexandra Chabotaru, your host, and together with my guests, we will tackle a new field of work in each episode. The aim of this podcast is to deep dive into career perspectives and strategies to navigate your desired path for success. Enjoy! This episode is supported by Spaces. Spaces is more than just a co-working place. What makes Spaces so unique is the community that we've been working to create. Add an international network of mobile workplaces and see how Spaces keeps you engaged and open to new opportunities at spacesworks.com. Hello all, and welcome to a new episode of the Female Role Models podcast. Today, we're going to discuss space science, digging deeper into the science field and how does the life of an astrophysicist look like. My next guest is the first person to obtain a doctorate in astrophysics from a Lebanese university. She is a space scientist at the University of Cambridge and a program director at Cambridge Judge Business School's Entrepreneurship Center. She is also the founder of She Speaks Science. Through all of her initiatives, she aims to make science accessible and women in STEM more visible, one story at a time. Please welcome my next guest, Dr. Ghina Halabi. Welcome, Ghina. How are you?
Thank you, Alexandra, for the introduction. I'm very good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy that we finally converse. We've been messaging back and forth for a few weeks, and I'm so happy that now I get to talk to you about science, about astrophysics, and to hear more about your absolutely amazing journey into this very interesting profession.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you here as well and to talk to your audience about my experience so far.
I've actually listened to a couple of podcasts that you've done previously, and I must say that your journey is impressive, and the way that you link astrophysics with general life and how women are perceived in this field and what can we do to make science more accessible to women. I really love the fact that you are a role model and an advocate for that. So thank you for doing it. I think it's very important to have people like you around that share the message and are very active in this field. I wanted to start by letting people know who is Ghina in 1-2 sentences. Can you tell us more about yourself?
Yes. If I'm to describe myself in one word, that word would be an explorer. I sometimes think of myself as an explorer of the cosmic and the earthly, as an astrophysicist or an explorer of the cosmos and the universe, the universe and the stars. I learned a thing or two about perspective, and this quite informs my other roles. So now I realize that my role, however small, it plays its part in a bigger system. And so on Earth, I try to use that perspective to make some difference, whether in my work as a storyteller, as a science communicator, connecting and engaging the public with science, or through business and my work at Cambridge Judge Business School, building an educational program for entrepreneurs, or as a founder and social entrepreneur working on She Speaks Science.
What do you do as a scientist, and what is your research focused on now at the University of Cambridge?
So my research in astrophysics revolved around understanding the stars. So how stars evolve, how they are born, how they live their lives, and how they die. And as a star, evolves, it goes through different phases. Just like a human being. And through these different phases, a star does different things. And I was mainly interested in how stars create the chemical elements in the universe. So for example, when you look at the carbon and the oxygen and the nitrogen and the silver, all of these elements are forged in the furnaces inside of stars. But each of these elements are created in different stellar environments, different types of stars, different masses, etc. So my research was to dig deeper and understand where these elements, which stellar environments these elements were formed and how. And this ultimately informs where we came from, because the elements that created our bodies were also formed in stars. So this was really the focus of my research.
I want to also discuss the scientist path, because I personally feel that there's obviously more to discuss than the name of your research. So, what are some of the challenges that you face as a scientist, and what are maybe some of the special traits of being a scientist? Can you give us more details into what does it mean to be a generally scientist?
Mm. Okay, that's quite an interesting question, Alexandra, because I think I have two answers for it. The classical boring answer, and the answer, that would be closer to me personally and to my, kind of philosophy in life. The typical classical answer would be that a scientist is somebody who is looking for the truth, is looking for knowledge, is looking to understand the universe from, the subatomic level up to the galactic scale. And a scientist does that by through the scientific method. So what is that? A typical application of the scientific method is that you as a scientist would develop a hypothesis, and then you start testing your hypothesis through various different ways, and then depending on the outcome of these experiments, of these tests, you modify your hypothesis. So then your hypothesis gets retested and modified and tested again until it becomes consistent with what you observe. It becomes consistent with the experiment outcomes that you're getting. Sometimes this scientific method has to be modified slightly. So for example, in my case, I study stars. You can't really test our understanding on stars in a very direct way. And the reason is, when you look at, you cannot replicate a star in the lab. Okay, so you need to modify this scientific method a little bit, because when you observe a star, you are looking at, generally speaking, on its surface, so you have no insight what's happening inside the star. So your equations, the things that you have and the tools you have to understand what's happening in a star, cannot be directly tested. So you do a hypothesis, you run a computer simulation, you predict what's going on inside the star, and then you observe to what you see on the surface, and this informs what can be happening inside the star. So sometimes constraints like this exist, but this is typically a scientific method, and this is how we can decide what is science and what isn't. This is why, for example, astrology is not a science, because it doesn't obey the scientific method. Now, this is the classical idea of what a scientist does. Now, according to me, here's how I think about it. A scientist is a protagonist on the quest for truth. And along the way, she faces difficulties, she faces obstacles. And this is what makes it fun. And this is, at the heart of it, is the story. It's a story. It's a story of this explorer, this protagonist on a quest for truth. And just like a story has a theme, it has a moral, so does the science. It has a reason. It has, an aim. It wants to answer why. And generally speaking, the pursuit of science is to better the human life in one way or another. And this is how you can see that science is a story of exploration. And this is why I started bringing science and storytelling together in my work.
I love that. I actually would like to hear more about your journey into astrophysics. I know that you are from Lebanon, because you've mentioned that you were the first person to obtain a doctorate in astrophysics from a Lebanese university. And that was a big thing because obviously nobody else before you had that occasion. How did that come together? Can you tell us more about how you decided to go into science, and what were some of the decisions that made you go in that direction?
Mm. I think my story with science starts from a place of curiosity, perhaps, curiosity and a bit of rebellion and challenge. I was very curious as a kid, and I think this fueled my love for science and exploration. I always used to ask why. I drove my parents mad asking why. And this rebellious nature, I suppose, allowed me to challenge what seemed to me at the time, to be quite oppressive realities, starting from the lack of access. You know, I originally, as a teenager, I wanted to be a pilot in the Air Force, but I couldn't tell how I can be one. You know, I had no role models. So it seemed to me at the time like I had no permission. It also, I mean, I also linked to this is a lack of opportunity. As
Mm.
you mentioned, there has been no PhD in astrophysics that was made in Lebanon, that was homegrown. So I had to create that first one. I had to forge that path and create that opportunity for me. And I think my journey with astrophysics started by studying physics, simply because I found it quite challenging. It was really difficult. I found it difficult and challenging, and that made me interested. And then I fell into astrophysics by coincidence, really. Which is a bit strange for people who do astronomy and astrophysics, because generally speaking, they're like fascinated by the cosmos from a very young age. For me, I was also, I mean, I grew up in a village on the mountains of Lebanon, and you can imagine in summer with all the clear skies, you know, and being a village, we had little light pollution. So of course that was fascinating. But I didn't always think I'd become an astrophysicist. That happened to me later on when I was doing my research.
When you decided to go into this sector, that is, to be honest, quite specific,
Mm.
did you have a, let's say, conversation with somebody, or did you have any sort of, somebody that created an impact for you when you said, you know what, I don't really know anybody that did this PhD, for example, but I can be the one? What made you decide to go that way?
Yeah. So when I was doing my master's degree in physics in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut. And for the master's degree, you need to do a project at the end of the degree. And I was exploring many different avenues for my research. Part of those, or one of those, was experimental physics. Also because I like to work with my hands, and I was, you know, many fields were of huge interest to me. And while I was searching for, you know, the best topic for me, I had a conversation with a professor at the university who was an astrophysics professor. Now, to clarify here, there had been people who are astrophysicists in Lebanon, Lebanese, but they've got their degrees from outside of Lebanon. And this professor, Munib Al-Aid, his name is, we had a conversation, and he said, he described his research to me, you know, stars, how they evolve, and, you know, who wouldn't be fascinated? Yeah. And he gave me a book to read, and we went on a summer holiday. It was a summer holiday, and I got really interested. And then I started doing the research, and I found it fascinating. And at the same time, I started going to conferences, you know, astronomy conferences in Europe and elsewhere. And as I started to know more about the astrophysics and astronomy communities, I connected with the people, with the students, and I loved it. So back in Lebanon, I decided to go ahead with that degree. Although it was, as a group, imagine, it was just me and my PhD my at the time master's supervisor. So it was a bit isolating, but having these connections and going to these conferences kept the fuel going, was the fuel that kept me going. And so when I finished my master's degree, I had the opportunity either to go into, to do a job, to have a job, or to do a PhD. And I was conflicted. But my father, he had big influence on me. He's no longer with us. I lost him 5 years ago. But he had big influence on me, and he said that you rarely get an opportunity to do a PhD if you now decide to get a job. Well, you can always get a job. So I decided to go that way, and this is how officially my journey with astrophysics started.
That's really great to hear. I like the fact that you also mentioned how discussing with your family was important to you, because I do know that there are places and people that um, may have a harder setup when it comes to family influence, meaning
Mm.
that if they might ask their parents or their grandparents or uncles and aunts about their path, they might not get the reply that they want, or they might not get a reply that is satisfactory to what they wanted to hear.
That's spot on. The role of parents, but also I'd like to emphasize, Alexandra, that for your listeners and the young people who are looking into starting a career in science, I'd advise them and to start talking to people at a very young age and to start exploring and connecting. It's also very essential to kind of expand their social circle that advises them on their career paths, and the more you ask, the better.
Definitely. What is your view on joining STEM subjects? So I would love to discuss this topic because you are one of the role models in this industry, right? In this field. Why
Mhm.
aren't more women around the world joining the STEM subjects? And I had some numbers that I crunched before our
Mhm.
interview here. I looked at a study from the World Economic Forum from 2020, and it
Mhm.
said that female students and employees are underrepresented in STEM related fields. On average, around 30% of the world's researchers are women. Less than a third of female students choose to study higher education courses in subjects like math and engineering. And women are more attracted to STEM courses in some region of the world than in others, but the global situation remains characterized by gender imbalances. On top of that, in the UK, it shows that women make up 30% of STEM students in higher education. However, in the USA, women who choose to rise to the challenge and pursue a STEM career, they later face the prospect of unequal pay and restricted career progression.
Mhm.
Gender disparities adversely affect economic growth and social progress. And this was a study from UNESCO from last year. What can we learn from role models like you about what can we do to have more female joining the STEM field?
Mm. Well, to put things in context for those who are not familiar with STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, and why is this such a big conversation? It's because STEM fields are increasingly shaping our daily lives. So our civilization, our daily life is becoming more and more dependent on these products of STEM research and STEM careers. And this is why STEM education in general is becoming a priority for governments around the world. However, we have a shortage in STEM researchers and STEM professionals and the students who study STEM. And because of this move of our societies and our innovation and the need to solve problems, this shortage in STEM skills is affecting the economy. So, for example, in the UK, the estimate is that this shortage in skills, it's costing businesses about 1.5 billion pounds a year. So let's first establish that scientists and STEM careers are very important for our economies and for our for our social and economic progress. However, on top of this shortage in STEM skills, we have an underrepresentation of women. And this, Alexandra, is a most complicated affair. It's quite an evident gap all over the world. And in the UK, for example, you mentioned about 30% are students. I think my statistics in terms of STEM careers is that they're about 22%. In engineering, it's even lower. It's about 12% who are women. Now, where is the problem? The complication of this issue is that the problem has many different facets. First, you have the social bias. These normative ideas of who a scientist is. And generally speaking, if you look at, you know, in general, you find that a scientist, the way the media depicts a scientist, or the way history depicted a scientist, is that he is a middle-aged, middle-class white man. And so this is one reason why young girls, for example, self-select out of STEM. They think it's not for them, you know, because they do not see themselves in this profession. And this brings in the importance of role models, obviously, which we will talk about. Another reason is the historical bias. You know, history is against us. And it affects our perception. I mean, in my field, if you look at the number of female astronauts, they make about 11%, 12%, something like that. Spacewalkers, 7%. You know, the numbers are playing against us. There's also the role of parents. Sometimes parents push their girls away from STEM, thinking it's not a very feminine career. The media, you know, I go to London on the tube, on the train, and then take the tube. And on both journeys, I find these, images of a boy playing with trains and a girl being a nurse. I mean, it's everywhere. We see these images everywhere. You go to buy a toy for a child and you go down the aisle of girls, you find you find the unicorns, and you go down the aisles of the boys, you find all these exciting things like trains and volcanoes and dinosaurs, you know. So this also affects us. There's also the social circles. You know, the parents, besides the parents, grandparents, the neighbors, the friends. There's peer pressure. Sometimes if a girl thinks, oh, I want to become an engineer, maybe her friends would say, oh, really, it's not cool, you know? So this is also, and kids obviously want to conform. To add to this, the perception that STEM is hard, it's very dry, so it's not for me, and I need to be a genius. And this is why I'm trying to change that through storytelling and through my work with She Speaks Science. And lastly, there's the structural bias that you mentioned. The barriers if a woman decides to become a STEM professional, she goes into the workplace and she faces all these barriers that you mentioned in terms of promotion, in terms of pay gap, etc. So to face that, you need interventions across the whole spectrum, across the whole journey, from education at a young age up until professional circles and the way corporates and companies and institutions need to deal with this.
How can we make the industry more appealing to young leaders?
So there's definitely, we need to fix the system. We need to fix the way women are being treated professionally, and is achieving or bridging that pay gap, getting rid of that pay gap is in the right direction. Also, how women are treated in the workplace. When we think about flexible working, for example, when we think about all these issues that women face in their careers, because generally speaking, caring responsibilities fall on the women's plate. So there are two aspects of it. There's society and the societal expectations of what a woman needs to do or not, and professionally speaking, companies accommodating the needs of women, and from flexible working, etc. But also the role models. I mean, we need to fix the system, obviously, because we cannot start encouraging, or we will be, I mean, we are encouraging girls and women to take up STEM, but we don't want them we don't want them to be going into this system that will mistreat them, you know. So there's work that should be done in parallel. And to try to address this problem, obviously, we need a variety of role models. Who are our role models? You know, now there are algorithms that, for example, newspapers that they implement to just check how many times in an article they say she said and how many times we say he said. Because if the journalists keep going, for example, to the male experts simply because they're more visible, I mean, you are feeding a stereotype here. We need to look for the experts who may be less visible or less vocal because they exist. So keeping in mind who are our role models, not just in gender, mind you, role models of different ethnic backgrounds, and this is really essential, of different scientific backgrounds, but also role models coming from different, socioeconomic backgrounds. And this is important. And I think this is one of the focuses of your podcast, to show these people coming from backgrounds who might be a bit more challenged, like you said earlier. And also something people miss often is the diversity, is the cognitive diversity, and people who have different learning styles and learning abilities. I'm thinking dyslexic people or people with ADHD. And now we have established research that, dyslexia, for example, is linked to problem solving. People with dyslexia are innovators, they are scientists. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Helen Taylor, who works on human cognitive evolution, her research shows this. And we were discussing this once, and she said that there's a lady who does research on dyslexia, and in her family there are 4 Nobel Prize winners in science who are believed to be dyslexic. So we need to show these role models as well, because to a person with dyslexia, it can be very traumatizing not to know that there are ways forward.
I couldn't have said it better. I love the fact that you've mentioned, the importance of showcasing role models from different walks of life. And I would love if you could give us more details about some of the initiatives that you've taken to emphasize on role models, because you founded and you are also the director of She Speaks Science. And I would like to tell listeners what the project is about, and also I heard the very nice analogy with Scheherazade from 1001 Nights and women in science. I would love if you can share with listeners that story, because I thought it was really, really inspiring.
Yes, Shahrazad and She Speaks Science. The idea started by, I'm Lebanese, and as a Lebanese, I was raised listening to these stories about, 1001 Nights and Shahrazad, the storyteller. But not everybody is familiar with this story. But the short version of it is that the king in this story, he discovered that his wife is unfaithful, and so he decided to take revenge on all the women in the kingdom. So that way there was terror in this kingdom. There was a huge injustice, and the women were either escaping for their lives or they're being executed for no wrongdoing of their own. Now, Shahrazad was a very smart and tactful woman, and she decided to face this injustice, and she had a plan. So she decided to become the next bride of the king, but every day Shahrazad would tell the king a story, and just at the moment when the time of the execution comes, she stops the story at a cliffhanger. And so the king had to postpone the execution to the next day to hear the end of her tale. Except that the next day she would do exactly the same thing, finish the story, start another, leave it on a cliffhanger. And so he had to keep her alive day after day, night after night for 1,001 nights. And by the end, he was aware of how wrong and mistaken he was, and he spares her life. So this story came to my mind, and I thought, hang on, now in our modern life, we don't have this mad king, but we do have this mad injustice. You know, this injustice takes the shape and form of this inequality we've been talking about in terms of underpay, underrepresentation, underpromotion, etc., etc. So if Shahrazad decides to start telling these stories and engage the people first before anybody else with her science, with her research, and keeps them interested, she would start to challenge this narrative. That narrative starts to change by simply owning her story, her experiences, and her struggles. And this was a moment of truth to me. And then, so I decided, originally the platform was called Shahrazad Speaks Science, but then we moved into offering more products. And so now the initiative is called She Speaks Science, the enterprise is She Speaks Science, and Shahrazad is our monthly publication. And the reason behind this monthly publication, so we have storytellers from all over the globe working on neuroscience, astronomy, space, rocket science, physics, biology. So we feature a story about these women researchers that they have written, and we edit on the website. And so by owning their stories, we can, promote women and show the woman is moving the needle in the sciences, and we spare other women from this injustice of representation. And what we do in these stories is that they are we make them socially relevant to the people, so that the science becomes humanized in a way and becomes closer to the reader. So the aim of She Speaks Science really is to spark the enthusiasm for STEM among the young generation, and at the same time promote the work of these incredible women doing really impactful STEM research.
I love that, and what a nice story. And the idea itself, it's so creative the way you thought about it. And I'm sure that most of the listeners know about the folk tale, so they would definitely remember when they were kids and they were told this story by their grandparents or their parents. I also know that you've been involved in Postscript's publication, if I'm not mistaken, where
Yeah,
you reimagine Greek muses as women of color. And I would
yeah.
like to tell us what did the project mean for you, and what did it entail exactly?
Yeah, that was a wonderful project, Alexandra, and thanks for mentioning it. I was contacted by this magazine, a cultural magazine called Postscript, and they are based in London. And what they aim is to highlight these women of color, moving the needle in their industries, each in her own way. And one of their projects posed the following question. They asked themselves, what if we re-examine our sources of inspiration through a wider lens? And what does that mean, sources of inspiration? Our role models, yeah? This is a bigger word for our role models. And then the question dug deeper. Of these mythological muses that inspire us in the Greek mythology. So they asked, what if we can destruct these muses and reimagine them with modern interpretations? And these
Mm.
modern interpretations meant just look around you and see who's doing the work and who's doing amazing stuff. So I was featured in this publication as the muse for astronomy, the Greek muse for astronomy, Urania. And I had 8 other muses alongside me, muse for history and poetry, sacred poetry and music. Um, so it was great because it kind of challenges these narratives that we're, that we experience and we read about and live our entire lives. So there's an element of cultural innovation there, an element of retelling of history, you know.
Mm.
And that was brilliant. It was a brilliant project, and I was extremely proud to be part of it. I, alongside other women of color, being featured as these modern muses of inspiration. um, and yeah, it was one of my favorite projects I was part of.
I do know that representation, sometimes it's very hard to see yourself out there if nobody
Mm.
else has been doing what you aim to do, or if it hasn't been a person that resembles you or your values. So it's so important to have role models from all walks of life. And I'm definitely going to share some of your initiatives so people can read more about it. I would like to end the interview with the advice section. What
Mhm.
advice can you share with those that feel the scientific path might be for them? Or what about those professionals that feel maybe underrepresented in the field? So you can either focus, or on both if you want, on the scientific path, or generally when we talk about people feeling underrepresented. What is your
Mm.
advice about tackling that barrier, and how should people see it and get past those barriers?
Many different things that come to my mind now. For those who want to become people, or professionals that they can't see at the moment, I'd encourage them to do slightly more research and dig deeper and look harder, because chances are they will find that role model somewhere, and who they can identify with. But if they can't, they have to create their own path, and this is okay as well. It could be harder. I mean, I tried it myself. I forged my own path. But it's also very exciting. And I'd advise them not to be turned off by the challenge of it, because sometimes excitement lies in that challenge, in tackling that difficulty. So that would be the first advice. The second advice is to own their story. And this is at the heart of what I do in everything, particularly with She Speaks Science. Own your experiences, own what you've achieved so far, and have the courage to share it with the world, because that's what makes you special, and that's what ultimately will get you to places. The world is becoming a very crowded place, and any career profession you choose for yourself, chances are you will have a crowd looking to do the same thing, looking to get the same job. So how do you differentiate yourself? How do you convince that next boss to hire you, or that next PhD supervisor to take you on as a student? So own that story, that heritage, that culture, where you come from. It's very powerful. The third piece of advice, perhaps, is to take up space, to dare to take up space. I suppose in my case, it plays both ways: to take up space, space science, and to take up space in a more, figurative way, to take up space in whatever profession they choose, to have that confidence, to share that passion, because that's what will ultimately get them to places.
Hmm. That's beautifully said. I'm very happy to hear that now you get to be that role model for others that might want to have a very similar path to yours, and they can listen to your advice live, and you can influence their life in such a beautiful way. Thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a very, very interesting talk. I hope the listeners really took your advice and really listened to what you had to say about the scientific community. There's definitely some work to be done, and I'm happy that there are people like you who are always there to emphasize on the importance of being represented. So thank you for taking the time, Gina. This has been really, really nice.
Thank you, Alexandra. This has been equally pleasurable for me. And I want to say thank you for this platform. Thank you for highlighting the incredible role models you have been talking to. And I would like to connect with your audience in one way or shape or form. I'd encourage them to connect with me, whether on LinkedIn or on my website, and to tell me that I heard you speak on the Female Role Models podcast. I'd love to hear from them. And if you are listening to us and you are a woman in science, we would love you to own your story on She Speaks Science. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to feature your work and the important research that you're doing. And if you just want to contribute to that cause and further it with us, to join the team, it's an open invitation, because we always rely on the willpower and the labor of love of those who believe in our mission to help more young people take up STEM and solve the problems that our humanity will face in the coming decade.
I hope you felt inspired to take charge of your next career move. Remember to review this podcast and share your comments. Thank you.